There is a moment in sacred history that stands alone, etched into the bedrock of faith like a scar of terrible beauty. It is the image of Abraham, his hand raised, the knife glinting in the harsh sun of Mount Moriah, his beloved son Isaac bound upon the altar. For millennia, this has been presented as the ultimate test of faith, the final, terrifying exam of a man's devotion to his God. We are told this is the pinnacle of obedience, a story so profound it has shaped 3 world religions. We see the angel's intervention, the ram caught in the thicket, and we breathe a collective sigh of relief. The test is over. Abraham has passed. But have you ever felt a strange unease in the silence that follows? Have you ever wondered why this test feels so sudden, so extreme? It's as if we've been dropped into the final act of a grueling drama without ever seeing the scenes that came before. We are shown a man capable of the most unimaginable act of surrender, yet the Bible remains hauntingly quiet about the journey that forged such a soul. It's like celebrating a marathon runner by only watching the final, agonizing meter of their race, ignoring the hundreds of miles of pain, doubt, and relentless endurance that made that final step possible. What trials hardened Abraham's heart to such a degree of trust? What smaller surrenders prepared him for the ultimate one? The narrative in Genesis moves with a speed that feels almost incomplete. It presents this moment as a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, a sudden test to prove a point. But faith, like Abraham's, is not born in an instant. It is forged in fire. It is hammered into shape on the anvil of repeated suffering and unwavering perseverance. The silence surrounding the forging of this great faith is not a reverent pause. It feels like an omission. It feels like we are being shown the monument without being told the story of the quarry, the sweat, and the broken stones that went into its construction. What if the story of Mount Moriah was never meant to be a standalone event? What if it was simply the 10th and final chapter of a much longer, more arduous saga of testing that has been deliberately condensed? Its preceding trials edited out of the official record tonight. We look past the peak of the mountain and into the long, dark valleys that Abraham was forced to walk through first. The answers to what forged Abraham's soul are not found by reading between the lines of Genesis. The missing chapters of his struggle are not hidden in allegorical interpretations or rabbinic traditions. Once again, the trail leads us back to the censored testimony, the heavenly chronicle that remembers what human history chose to forget, the Book of Jubilees. And what it reveals about Abraham does not diminish his faith, but magnifies it to a scale that is almost unbearable to comprehend. Jubilees steps forward as a witness and makes a staggering claim that reframes the entire narrative. It declares that the binding of Isaac was not a singular, isolated test. It was merely the final, brutal climax of a series of 10 distinct trials that God brought upon Abraham throughout his life. 10 moments of intense pressure designed to purify his spirit and test the limits of his obedience. The story we remember is only the final exam, administered after he had already passed 9 other grueling tests that have been almost entirely erased from the mainstream record. Imagine a warrior celebrated for his final victory-clinching battle, while the 9 bloody, desperate skirmishes he fought to even reach that field are never mentioned. That is what has been done to the story of Abraham. We have been given the conclusion without the context, the victory without the full story of the war. Jubilees doesn't just add detail, it restores the missing 9/10 of Abraham's spiritual journey. It presents his life not as a series of blessed events punctuated by one terrible day, but as a relentless crucible, a long obedience in the same direction, marked by repeated loss, fear, and unwavering trust. This revelation forces us to ask an unsettling question. Why would such a profound testament to perseverance be suppressed? Why would the scribes and gatekeepers of Scripture condense an epic saga of faith into a single, dramatic moment? What was so dangerous about showing the full extent of Abraham's suffering and endurance? Perhaps a patriarch who passes one perfect test is a more comfortable figure to admire from a distance. A patriarch who is tested again and again and again, who faces famine, abduction, family strife, and the demands of a covenant that seems to bring as much pain as promise, is a figure far too relatable, his journey too close to our own struggles. The scribes may have hidden the 9 trials to preserve a more pristine image of the great patriarch, but in doing so, they stole from us the true lesson of his life, that faith is not a single leap in the dark. It is a long, arduous climb, made up of 1,000 smaller steps of trust, taken in the face of 1,000 trials, both great and small. Jubilees restores that journey, and now we will walk it with him. The first set of trials Abraham faced were not attacks from external enemies, but a systematic dismantling of every earthly security he had ever known. Before he could become the father of a great nation, he first had to become a man utterly dependent on a promise. Genesis records the first of these God's call to leave his home, his country, and his father's house in Ur of the Chaldees. While Genesis presents this as a single, decisive command, Jubilees frames it as the first official trial, a test of separation. This was not a simple relocation. It was a spiritual amputation. He was being asked to sever himself from his identity, his inheritance, his entire social and economic safety net, and to walk into the unknown based on nothing more than a voice. But the moment he obeyed, the second trial began, striking at the most primal human need: survival. A great famine swept through the land of promise. This is a detail of cruel irony that Jubilees emphasizes. The very land God had promised him could not sustain him. He, the chosen one, the friend of God, was now a starving refugee, forced to flee to the pagan land of Egypt. This trial was designed to test a fundamental question: do you trust the giver, even when the gift seems to be failing? Do you hold to the promise? Even when the promised land is barren, it forced Abraham to look beyond the physical territory and place his hope in the divine source of his calling. These first 2 trials worked in tandem to strip Abraham of everything the world calls security. The first took his past, his family, and his culture. The second took his present, his food, and his safety in the land he was meant to inherit. He was being systematically unmoored from the world, left with nothing to cling to but the invisible word of God. This wasn't just a journey across a landscape, it was a journey into radical dependence. The scribes who compiled Genesis recorded these events, but by not explicitly framing them as part of a divine curriculum of testing, they softened their impact. they become mere biographical details. Jubilees restores their true weight. These were not random hardships. They were the first calculated lessons in the school of faith. They were designed to break Abraham's reliance on the seen, the tangible, the familiar. He had to learn that his true homeland was not a place on a map, and his true source of provision was not a field of grain. His entire world was being recalibrated to a new center of gravity, not the stability of earth, but the faithfulness of heaven. And only after he had learned to stand on this new, invisible ground could he be prepared for the trials that would attack the very heart of the promise itself. Having been stripped of his past and his immediate security, Abraham's trials now escalated, shifting from a test of his dependence to a direct assault on the future God had promised him. He was destined to be the father of a great nation, but this next set of trials would repeatedly threaten the very people who were meant to form its foundation. The first of these attacks came through his nephew, Lot. After their separation, war erupted in the valley. The Book of Genesis records that Lot and his entire household were captured by a coalition of conquering kings. For Abraham, this was more than a family crisis. It was a test of his covenant responsibility. He was a sojourner, a man of peace, with a household of only a few hundred men. To march against a victorious royal army was suicidal. Yet, Lot was his blood, a part of the family line that, for all Abraham knew, might still play a role in God's plan. Jubilees frames this not as a heroic rescue mission, but as a trial of courage and loyalty. He was forced to risk everything he had: his life, his wealth, his people, to defend a promise that was not yet visible. No sooner had he proven his faithfulness in battle than a more insidious threat emerged, one that would repeat with haunting regularity. Upon entering Egypt and later Gerar, the beauty of his wife, Sarai, drew the lustful eyes of kings. Twice, she was taken into the harems of powerful rulers, Pharaoh and Abimelech. Genesis records these events, but Jubilees highlights them as distinct, terrifying trials. This was not merely an attack on his marriage, it was an attack on the sacred vessel of the covenant. Sarai was the designated mother of the promised heir. If her bloodline was compromised, the entire divine plan would be thrown into chaos. Twice, Abraham was rendered utterly powerless, forced to watch as the mother of nations was taken from him. He could not fight armies or kings. All he could do was trust that the God who made the promise was capable of protecting it from the lusts of powerful men. These were trials of profound helplessness, designed to teach him that the fulfillment of the covenant did not rest on his own strength or wisdom, but on God's direct, miraculous intervention. One can almost sense why the scribes might have downplayed the repetition of this event. To show the great patriarch making the same mistake twice, endangering his wife out of fear, might have seemed to tarnish his image. But Jubilees preserves it to teach a deeper lesson. It shows that God's faithfulness is not contingent on Abraham's perfection. It reveals a God who protects his promise even when his chosen servant is faltering. The trials of family were not just about testing Abraham, they were about demonstrating the unwavering, unstoppable resolve of God himself. And Abraham was learning, through each terrifying ordeal, that his family's destiny was held not in his own hands, but in the hands of the one who had called them out of darkness. With each trial he endured, Abraham's faith was being forged. But the central promise, the promise of a son through Sarai, remained agonizingly unfulfilled. The years stretched into decades. His body grew old, and Sarai's womb remained barren. This long, silent waiting was itself a trial, a slow, grinding test of hope against the crushing reality of time. It is in this context of desperation that the next set of trials unfolds, each one cutting closer to the heart of the covenant. The first was the trial of a surrogate heir. It was Sarai herself who, in her despair, proposed the solution that Genesis records for Abraham to take her servant, Hagar, and bear a son through her. The birth of Ishmael was not an act of sinful rebellion, but a misguided attempt to help God fulfill his promise. Yet, this human solution brought not relief, but strife. The conflict that erupted between Sarai and Hagar turned Abraham's household into a place of bitterness. This was a trial of patience and discernment. Would he wait for God's miracle, or would he settle for a man-made alternative? Then came a trial that tested his physical commitment to a promise that still seemed impossible. God established the covenant of circumcision, demanding that Abraham, at 99 years of age, and every male in his household bear a permanent physical mark of their covenant identity. As Jubilees emphasizes, this was an act of profound faith. He was being asked to carve the sign of a promise for a son onto his own aged body, at a time when all natural hope for that son was gone. It was a physical declaration of belief in a biological impossibility. But the most gut-wrenching of these trials came after the miracle finally occurred. After Isaac was born, the joy of the long-awaited heir was once again shattered by the conflict in his home. Sarai demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away for Abraham. This was an agonizing command. Ishmael was his firstborn son, his own flesh and blood. To cast him out into the wilderness felt like an act of cruel abandonment. As Jubilees portrays it, this was a trial of sacrifice that served as a dark and painful foreshadowing of what was to come. He was being asked to surrender his first son, the son of human effort, to fully embrace his second son, the son of divine promise. Each of these trials was a surgical cut, separating Abraham from a different kind of earthly hope, the hope in a logical solution, the hope in his own physical ability, and the hope in his natural affection for his firstborn. He was being systematically stripped of every alternative until only one thing remained: the raw, unbelievable, miraculous promise of God centered on Isaac. The scribes recorded these stories, but Jubilees frames them in their true context as the painful, necessary preparations for the final test. Before God would ask Abraham to place Isaac on the altar, he first made him surrender everything else. For centuries, the story of Isaac's binding has been framed as a profound, solitary dialogue between Abraham and God. The Book of Genesis states it plainly: God tested Abraham. The command comes directly from the heavens, a stark and terrifying decree with no apparent intermediary. We are left to wrestle with the image of a God who would demand such a sacrifice, a theological mystery that has troubled believers and skeptics alike for millennia. We see the test and we see the divine resolution, but what we don't see what was deliberately edited out of the canonical record, is the third player in this drama, the unseen accuser who provoked the test in the first place. It is here that the Book of Jubilees makes its most shocking revelation, pulling back the veil not just on earthly events, but on the proceedings of the heavenly court. It testifies that the final, most extreme trial of Abraham was not initiated by God in isolation. It was a response to a direct challenge from a powerful, malevolent entity, the chief of the evil spirits, a being named Prince Mastema. Jubilees recounts a scene that unfolds before the throne of God. After Abraham has endured 9 trials, Mastema, whose name means hatred or hostility, steps forward as a celestial prosecutor. He addresses God not with a plea, but with an accusation. He argues that Abraham's faithfulness has never truly been tested to its limit. He essentially says, "You have blessed him, protected him, given him a son in his old age. Of course he is loyal, but does he love you more than he loves the very promise you gave him? Command him to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And then we will see if his devotion is real." This changes everything. The command to sacrifice Isaac is no longer a bolt from the blue, an inscrutable test born from the mind of God alone. It is a divine response to the slander of the accuser. God does not issue the command to satisfy a cruel whim, but to silence the chief adversary in the presence of the entire heavenly host. Abraham's ordeal on Mount Moriah is transformed from a private test of faith into the public centerpiece of a cosmic legal battle. He is not merely a servant being tested by his master, he is God's champion, chosen to prove the reality of human faith and love in the face of the ultimate accusation. Why would the scribes remove such a critical piece of the narrative? Perhaps the idea of God being challenged by a subordinate being was theologically uncomfortable. It complicates the simple picture of divine sovereignty. It introduces a dynamic where God allows his beloved servant to endure unimaginable agony in order to win a heavenly argument. It reveals that the struggles of humanity are not isolated events, but are often the very battleground where the great conflicts between heaven and the forces of darkness are decided. By removing Mastema from the story, the gatekeepers simplified the narrative, but they stripped it of its profound cosmic context. They left us with a God who seems to test his people arbitrarily, rather than a God who allows his people to become the living proof that refutes the accusations of evil. Jubilees restores the accuser to the courtroom, and in doing so, it restores the true and terrifying grandeur of what happened on that lonely mountain. Abraham was not just obeying God, he was silencing Satan. With the full 10-act drama of Abraham's faith laid bare, the motive for its censorship becomes tragically clear. We see a story not of one perfect leap of faith, but of a long, messy, and relentless journey. A journey filled with repeated failures, profound helplessness, and a cosmic battle instigated by a celestial accuser. And so we must ask again, who were the editors of this story, and why did they feel compelled to condense this epic into a single, polished chapter? The culprits, as before, were not malicious enemies of the faith. They were its most devoted guardians, the scribes, the generations of scholars and theologians who compiled, copied, and canonized the sacred texts. Their mission, as they saw it, was to preserve the Word of God, but also to present it in a way that was clear, powerful, and edifying for the people. And in their editorial judgment, the full, unabridged story of Abraham's 10 trials may have seemed problematic. Consider their motives. A story with 10 trials, including repeated instances of the patriarch endangering his wife, could be seen as diminishing his stature. It paints a picture not of a flawless hero, but of a flawed man being relentlessly forged. Perhaps they felt it was more inspiring to focus on the single, perfect moment of victory on Mount Moriah than to dwell on the long, difficult road that led there. They chose the highlight reel over the full game tape. Furthermore, the introduction of Prince Mastema as the instigator of the final test introduces a layer of cosmic complexity that could be seen as confusing or even theologically dangerous. It opens the door to questions about the nature of evil, the sovereignty of God, and the idea that heavenly beings can influence divine decisions. For a tradition seeking to establish a clear, monotheistic theology, it was perhaps far simpler and safer to present the test as a direct, unmediated command from God. It removed the unsettling image of a heavenly courtroom and a divine human drama playing out for an angelic audience. The scribes chose clarity over complexity. They chose a powerful, self-contained narrative over a sprawling, interconnected saga. They weren't necessarily trying to deceive, they were trying to distill. But in their distillation, they lost the essence of the process. They gave us the polished diamond, but hid the immense pressure and heat that it took to form it. They presented Abraham as a monument to faith, but they concealed the full human cost of becoming that monument. And in doing so, they gave us a hero to admire, but they stole from us a journey we could truly relate to. The decision to edit Abraham's journey, to reduce his 10 trials to a single climactic event, was not a minor redaction. It has had a profound and lasting impact on how we understand the very nature of faith itself. By presenting us with the peak of the mountain but hiding the arduous climb, the scribes left us with a beautiful but dangerously incomplete legacy. The most significant consequence is that it established an unrealistic and often paralyzing standard for faith. The story of Abraham, as it is commonly told, becomes about one impossible, heroic moment. It fosters a Mount Moriah theology, where we look for and often judge ourselves by singular dramatic tests of devotion. We wonder if we would have the strength to make such a sacrifice, and often conclude that we would not. The story, meant to inspire, instead becomes a source of inadequacy. But the full account in Jubilees teaches a different lesson entirely. It reveals that the kind of faith that can face Mount Moriah is not born in a moment of crisis. It is built, brick by painful brick, over a lifetime of smaller, less dramatic trials. It is forged in the famines, in the family conflicts, in the long years of waiting, in the daily choice to trust a promise over a reality. By hiding the 9 trials, the editors hid the process. They hid the training ground. They hid the truth that extraordinary faith is the result of ordinary, persistent obedience. This has created a spiritual culture that often misunderstands the nature of a trial. We see hardship as a sign of God's absence or our own failure, rather than as a part of the divine curriculum designed to strengthen us. The story of the 10 trials shows that Abraham's life was filled with moments that looked like failure and abandonment, yet each one was a necessary lesson. By losing this context, We have lost the roadmap for navigating our own trials. We look for a single, glorious victory, and we miss the sanctifying power of the long, slow, and often painful journey. The legacy of this shortened story is a faith that is often impatient, focused on dramatic outcomes rather than steadfast process. We have been given a portrait of a hero, when what we desperately needed was the biography of a pilgrim who stumbled, who feared, who made mistakes, but who never stopped walking. The Scribes, in their effort to present a perfect patriarch, unintentionally deprived us of the most encouraging truth of all, that the God of Abraham is not looking for flawless heroes. He is in the business of forging them, one trial at a time, for millennia. We have stood at the finish line, marveling at Abraham's final, triumphant step. We have built our theology around that single moment of breathtaking faith. But the dust of the Qumran caves and the faithful memory of ancient churches have now returned the lost footage to us. The Book of Jubilees has unedited the story. It has restored the 9 trials. It has given us back the full, grueling, and glorious marathon of Abraham's faith. And so, the choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient scribes. The decision to see only the final moment is no longer the only option. The choice now rests with you. The full story, with all its uncomfortable and encouraging details, is now before you. The evidence of a longer, harder journey has been presented. You can choose to remain at the finish line. You can continue to see Abraham's story as a singular, heroic act on a lonely mountaintop. It is a powerful image, and it has sustained faith for centuries. There is no shame in staying with the familiar, edited version of the story. It is, in many ways, a simpler and less demanding narrative. Or you can choose to see the whole race. You can choose to walk back along the path and witness the moments of doubt in the famine, the terror when Sarai was taken, the heartache of sending Ishmael away. You can choose to see the man who was relentlessly tested, who sometimes faltered, but who always, ultimately, chose to trust. You can choose to see a faith that was not a gift, but a muscle, built through a lifetime of resistance against the weight of an impossible reality. This is the moment where you reclaim the narrative. You are no longer just a recipient of a curated tradition. You are an investigator with access to the full case file. To choose to see the 10 trials is to choose a messier, more complex, but ultimately more profound and relatable faith. It is to accept that spiritual greatness is a process, not a performance. It is to give yourself permission to be a work in progress, just as the great patriarch was. The scribes made their choice for you. Now you get to make your own. Will you settle for the snapshot of the victory, or will you dare to watch the full, agonizing, and beautiful film of how that victory was won? The story of Abraham's 10 trials is not just a corrected historical record. It is a divine invitation. It is a call to reframe our entire understanding of what a life of faith looks like. We have been taught to seek mountaintop experiences, to look for the single dramatic moment that will define our devotion. But the full story of Abraham teaches us that true, enduring faith is forged in the valleys. It is built in the quiet, unseen decades of perseverance, in the choice to keep walking when the promised land is barren, and to keep believing when the promised son has not yet come. This is the ultimate truth that the Book of Jubilees restores to us. Your faith will not be defined by one singular moment on a future mountain. It is being defined right now, in the trial you are facing today, in the quiet battle against doubt, in the choice to remain obedient when it is difficult, in the long, slow work of becoming. Abraham is not just a hero to be admired from afar. He is a model of perseverance to be emulated in the trenches of our own lives. So, let this revelation be more than just knowledge. Let it be a source of profound encouragement. The next time you feel tested, the next time your journey feels long and your promises feel distant, remember the 9 trials. Remember the man who was tested by famine, by war, by family strife, by the silence of heaven, and by the taunts of the accuser. And remember that each trial was not a sign of God's disapproval, but a mark of his divine training. The greatest legacy of Abraham is not that he was willing to sacrifice his son. It is that he endured 9 other trials that made him into the man who could be willing. Your journey is no different. Do not despise the small tests. Do not lose heart in the long waiting. For these are the very things that are forging in you a faith that can withstand the weight of your own Moriah, whenever it may come. The true story of the father of faith is not about a perfect hero. It is about a persistent pilgrim. And that is a story in which we can all find our place. Welcome to the full story of the man who walked with God.